for those of you who are actually on this side of the room can see it, it is 8:15. This is when we're supposed to start. Come on in.
I had an Axl Rose moment and didn't want to go on stage right away, so.
No, it's 4 o'clock. My name is Darlene Farabee. I'm the chair of the English department, and I'm very glad to be here welcoming you to the Department of English Colloquium. Next week, in this room at the same time as this week, we will have Professor Lee Rohrapah, and her talk is Conversations in Contemporary American Poetry and Poetics. So you can come back next week on Monday after your Friday holiday for that talk. But this week, we have Dr. Skip Willman, who teaches courses in literary and cultural theory and contemporary American literature. He's also the coordinator of the graduate program in English. Dr. Willman has published essays on Don DeLillo, Stanley Elkin, Ian Fleming, Thomas Pynchon, and conspiracy theories in a range of journals, including Critique, Studies in Contemporary Fiction, Modern Fiction Studies, Contemporary Literature, and the Arizona Quarterly, among others. He is the co-editor and contributor to a book titled Ian Fleming and James Bond. He's currently completing a manuscript of another book, which is titled Cold War Catastrophes, Western Intelligence Failures in Post-World War II Fiction. So I would like to go ahead and introduce Dr. Willman and his talk, What Was Postmodernism 2.0?
Thank you very much. I will begin, as I always begin my classes, by invoking Frederick Jameson. In a recent interview in Social Text commemorating the 30th anniversary of his landmark essay, Postmodernism, or the Cultural Logic of Late Capitalism, Frederick Jameson remarks that he wishes his original essay had distinguished postmodernity as a historical period from postmodernism as a style or an aesthetic inventory of stylistic features. More importantly, Jameson contends that while postmodernism may be over, hence the title of my talk, What Was Postmodernism?, we have not yet reached the end of postmodernity by any stretch of the imagination. Nor is he alone in reaching this conclusion regarding the continuing relevance of postmodernity as a historical period, even as postmodernism as a style has waned. In his recent collection of essays, Literary Criticism of the 21st Century, Vincent Leitch contends that we still reside in the postmodern era with no end in sight. Today, I would like to explore this distinction between postmodernity and postmodernism by discussing the key theorists of all things postmodernism, while exemplifying these theories in the work of some of the most important novelists of this contemporary period. My presentation will conclude with a coda of sorts in which I will make a case for the continuing relevance of postmodernism in contemporary culture, although perhaps not in the place one would necessarily expect. So we begin with the novelist John Barth. The word postmodernism suggests a conflicted relationship with modernism. What exactly does that post denote? Does it mean a rejection of modernism, or does postmodernism merely signify what comes after modernism? In the Literature of Exhaustion in 1967, and its follow-up essay almost a little over a decade later, The Literature of Replenishment from 1979, the American novelist John Barth outlines the contours of literary postmodernism by differentiating it from modernism. In order to define modernism, Barth turns to literary critic Gerald Graff and summarizes his position the following way. The ground motive of modernism was a criticism of the 19th century bourgeois social order and its worldview. And its artistic strategy was the self-conscious overturning of the conventions of bourgeois realism. At this point, I am legally and professionally bound to insert a disclaimer regarding the unsophisticated nature of realism out of deference to my colleague, Dr. John Dudley, who a couple weeks ago said that realism was far more nuanced than we frequently gave it credit for, and Barth might be guilty of doing that here. After cataloging an extensive list of other features attributed to modernism, Barth singles out two for particular attention. First, he mentions the very high standards of artistry set by James Joyce and the other great modernists. Second, he discusses their famous relative difficulty of access, a theme we have seen in the past two lectures on modernism from Dr. Hagen and Dr. Love. Much like modernism's rejection of realism, postmodernism rejects modernism, and this is Barth talking. The modernist aesthetic is, in my opinion, unquestionably the characteristic aesthetic of the first half of our century. And in my opinion, it belongs to the first half of our century. Modernist coinages are by now more or less debased common currency. And because we don't really need more Finnegan's Wakes or Peas and Cantos. Fighting words, I know. Ben Hagen is ready to wrestle Barth for that one, I know. Nevertheless, Barth contends that postmodernism should retain the high level of artistry of modernism, including its formal experimentation and innovation. However, you can't get stuck in that period of the early 20th century. The true artist must be technically up to date. Art and its forms and techniques live in history and certainly do change. I sympathize with the remark attributed to Saul Bellow that to be technically up to date is the least important attribute of a writer, though I would add that this least important attribute may be nevertheless essential. So the true break with modernism occurs over the issue of the difficulty of access, which postmodernism, according to Barth, should jettison from its program. Here's what he says. My ideal postmodernist author neither merely repudiates nor merely imitates either his 20th century modernist parents or his 19th century pre-modernist grandparents. He has the first half of our century under his belt, but not on his back. Without lapsing into moral or artistic simplism, shoddy craftsmanship, Madison Avenue venality, or either false or real naivete, he nevertheless aspires to a fiction more democratic in its appeal than such late modernist marvels, by my definition, as Beckett's Text for Nothing or Nabokov's Pale Fire. He may not hope to reach and move the devotees of James Michener and Irving Wallace, very popular writers of the day, not to mention the great mass of television-addicted non-readers. But he should hope to reach and delight at least part of the time beyond the circle of what Thomas Mann used to call the early Christians, professional devotees of high art. According to Barth, in the literature of replenishment, Gabriel Garcia Marquez represents the model for postmodern fiction, particularly his novel 100 Years of Solitude, a book that offers delights for sophisticated literary critics and the great unwashed masses. John Barth himself attempted this program himself, and he put his theoretical reflections into practice in his 1973 National Book Award-winning Chimera, a book which rewrites the 1001 Nights as a framing story for his playful reimagining of the Greek myths of Perseus and Bellerophon. Each section of the novel tackles the art of storytelling, but particularly the opening section in which John Barth, the writer, magically appears as a genie to Scheherazade and feeds her the stories that she tells to King Shahryar to prolong her life and put a stop to the endless slaughter of women after their wedding nights. The lesson of storytelling, both Scheherazade and Barth agree, is that the key to the treasure is the treasure. The secret of the treasure house of new fiction lies in unlocking the mystery of how to produce new work, not the actual content itself. To be absolutely clear, then, in the literature of replenishment, Barth announces the end of the aesthetic of high modernism. And so we enter the era of postmodernism. But as we shall see, postmodernism represents more than a literary style or movement. And so we come to Jean-Francois Lyotard. The same year that Barth published his revised thesis on the end of modernism and his proposal for the project of postmodern literature, Jean-Francois Lyotard published The Postmodern Condition, a report on knowledge. It was not translated into English until 1984, but it was arguably the first serious philosophical foray into postmodernism. although Charles Jenks had written some books on architecture dating to the early 70s about postmodern architecture, but that's, architecture, not philosophy. According to Lyotard, postmodernism may be defined as, quote, incredulity toward meta-narratives. Incredulity toward meta-narratives. So, what is a meta-narrative? A meta-narrative is one of those all-encompassing stories of universal history that generally tends to propose human emancipation as its end, such as Christianity, the Enlightenment, and Marxism. In the Postmodern Explained, Lyotard helpfully clarifies what he means by meta-narratives. And that's the quote up here. The meta-narratives I was concerned with in the postmodern condition are those that have marked modernity, the progressive emancipation of reason and freedom, the progressive or catastrophic emancipation of labor, source of unalienated value in capitalism, the enrichment of all humanity through the progress of capitalist technoscience, and even, if we include Christianity itself in modernity, in opposition to the classicism of antiquity, the salvation of creatures through the conversion of souls to the Christian narrative of martyred love. Why is the Enlightenment included in this list? Marxism, it ended about 1991, supposedly. Well, for Lyotard, Auschwitz and Hiroshima signal the emergence of doubts regarding the emancipatory potential of reason, rationality, science, and technology. The entire German society was rationally organized to manufacture the death of the Jews and other undesirables on a massive scale, with deportation trains, concentration camps, gas chambers, and ovens. Genocide was perhaps not new to human history, but the scientific and technological sophistication of the program's execution with the Nazis was new. Here at home, the Manhattan Project raced the Nazis to build an atomic bomb, and the development of the atomic bomb was certainly a staggering scientific achievement. However, did its use on Hiroshima and Nagasaki at the end of World War II help to emancipate humanity? Or did its development, use in combat, and even testing threaten the annihilation of everything on the planet? Is that progress? The incredulity toward meta-narratives may be found throughout postmodern fiction, from Thomas Pynchon's harrowing depiction of the development of the V-2 rocket in Gravity's Rainbow, to Don DeLillo's darkly comic vision of the airborne toxic event in White Noise. However, I want to turn to Toni Morrison's Beloved for another example. In her lecture, The Sight of Memory, Morrison reminds her audience that racism was rampant within the Enlightenment. She writes, "One has to remember that the climate in which they, black writers of slave narratives and their white editors, wrote reflected not only the age of enlightenment, but its twin, born at the same time, the age of scientific racism. David Hume, Immanuel Kant, and Thomas Jefferson, to name only a few, had documented their conclusions that blacks were incapable of intelligence. Frederick Douglass knew otherwise, and he wrote refutations of what Jefferson said in Notes on the State of Virginia. Never yet could I find that a black had uttered a thought above the level of plain narration, never see even an elementary trait of painting or sculpture, a sentence that I've always thought ought to be engraved at the door to the Rockefeller collection of African art. Hegel in 1813 had said that Africans had no history and couldn't write in modern languages. Kant disregarded a perceptive observation by a black man by saying, "This fellow was quite black from head to foot, a clear proof that what he said was stupid." In Beloved, the character of school teacher represents the age of scientific racism. School teacher comes to Sweet Home after the death of Mr. Garner and studies his slaves. School teacher was teaching us things we couldn't learn. This is Setha speaking. I didn't care nothing about the measuring string. We all laughed about that, except Sixo. He didn't laugh at nothing. But I didn't care. School teacher had wrapped that string all over my head, crossed my nose, around my behind, numbered my teeth. I thought he was a fool. And the questions he asked was the biggest foolishness of all. One of Setha's traumatic moments occurs when she overhears school teacher mention her name with his pupils and realizes the significance of these measurements. This is a school teacher talking. No, that's not the way. I told you to put her human characteristics on the left, her animal ones on the right. And don't forget to line them up. Simply put, Sethe realizes that her masters do not view her as human. Getting back to Lyotard, he explains that the problem with scientific knowledge is that it is wonderful at producing descriptions of the world, and descriptions that produce tangible results, from the atomic bomb to the iPhone 7. However, science is unable to offer prescriptions. It cannot tell us what to do with our knowledge. To move from a description to a prescription, we generally have to move to a different form of legitimation based on narrative knowledge. Science tells us we can usefully experiment with stem cells, but it doesn't provide the basis for a decision on whether or not we should. Instead, many turn to fundamentalist Christian doctrine, a form of narrative knowledge or legitimation, for making that decision, and usually the decision not to experiment on stem cells or offering a prescription. Despite our doubts about these meta-narratives, according to Lyotard, knowledge within contemporary society is predominantly scientific, although he notes that knowledge and information have also been commodified. Therefore, capitalist technoscience has emerged as the dominant social structure with the performativity principle as the linchpin of its language game. Technology is therefore a game pertaining not to the true, the just, or the beautiful, but to efficiency. A technical move is good when it does better and/or expends less energy than another, or when it produces wonderful profits, or when it generates more and more research to keep universities and the academy afloat. In our era of Apple, Google, Yahoo, Facebook, Intel, Microsoft, Amazon, the relevance of Lyotard's observations regarding capitalist technoscience and its performativity principle as the key to understanding the postmodern condition seem pretty self-evident. Another key theorist of the postmodern is Jean Baudrillard. Unlike many of his contemporaries, Jean Baudrillard was not reluctant to assume the mantle of postmodernism. He was definitely a provocateur, and perhaps even a charlatan, but his work continually found productive ways to describe the postmodern experience with its emphasis on commodities, signs, images, the media, and the concepts for which he is best known, simulacra and simulations. In his influential book from 1981, Simulacra and Simulations, Baudrillard defines simulation as the generation by models of a real without origin or reality, a hyperreal. In other words, Baudrillard describes the ways in which reality has disappeared and been replaced by simulations, producing a hyperreality that blurs the distinctions between the real and the unreal. For Baudrillard, the best example, or one of the best examples, of simulation is Disneyland. Disneyland is a perfect model of all the entangled orders of simulacra. It is first of all a play of illusions and phantasms, the pirates, the frontier, the future world. The imaginary world is supposed to ensure the success of the operation. But what attracts the crowds the most is without a doubt the social microcosm, the religious, miniaturized pleasure of real America, of its constraints and joys. Disneyland exists in order to hide the fact that it is the real country, all of real America that is Disneyland. Disneyland is presented as imaginary in order to make us believe that the rest is real, whereas all of Los Angeles and the America that surrounds it are no longer real, but belong to the hyperreal order and to the order of simulation. There's no longer a question of a false representation of reality or ideology, but of concealing the fact that the real is no longer real, and thus of saving the reality principle. This is kind of hyperbolic rhetoric here out of Baudrillard, but since its publication, popular culture has been obsessed with the idea of simulation. From Jurassic Park, those are simulated dinosaurs. They ain't real ones, right? To The Matrix, a film in which the actual book, Baudrillard's book, Simulacra and Simulations, makes a little clever cameo. When they come to take him to this rave or this dance party, he has this hidden file hidden in a book that is a simulation of a book, right? Of a little file with the program. At any rate, simulacra do not have to take the form of dinosaurs, of course. They can assume human form. Blade Runner had its more human than human replicants, while my beloved Battlestar Galactica, and that's 6 from Battlestar Galactica, had its Cylons infiltrate the fleet of human survivors of the 9/11 style attack that wipes out most of the human population. Although I haven't seen it yet, Westworld is evidently working in similar territory. Star Trek: The Next Generation explored some of the philosophical ramifications of simulacra with the holodeck, which allowed the crew to escape into simulations of real and fictional places, although these simulations sometimes took on a dangerous life of their own, a far cry from the holodeck's intended purpose of recreation. And it's a shame that Dr. Ron Gans isn't here today, because I'm sure he could curate an episode-by-episode guide to the adventures of the Starship Enterprise involving the holodeck, and he would probably be wearing his Captain Kirk uniform. But there are other examples too. Christopher Nolan's Inception goes so far as to explore the possibility of simulating and therefore manipulating dreams. And comedy has also gotten into the act with Tropic Thunder. I don't know if any of you saw Tropic Thunder, but it comically blurs the lines or the boundaries between the real and the imaginary during the shooting of a fictional film with gritty documentary detail and method acting that slips into a real-life conflict straight out of Rambo. But enough of Hollywood. We want to get to the literary stuff, right? In White Noise, Don DeLillo finds a similarly comic way to explore simulations. During the evacuation of his city due to the airborne toxic event, a train accident that unleashes a chemical cloud of iodine D, the toxic byproduct of a whole host of agricultural and industrial chemicals, Jack Gladney, the protagonist, professor of Hitler studies at College on the Hill, consults a technician to discuss the health risks of his exposure. That's quite an armband you've got there, Jack says. What does SimUvac mean? Sounds important. Short for Simulated Evacuation, a new state program they're still battling over funds for. But this evacuation isn't simulated, it's real. We know that, but we thought we could use it as a model. A form of practice? Are you saying you saw a chance to use the real event in order to rehearse the simulation? We took it right into the streets. How's it going? I said. Well, the insertion curve isn't as smooth as we would like. There's a probability excess, plus which we don't have our victims laid out where we'd want them to if this was an actual simulation. In other words, we're forced to take our victims where we find them. We didn't get a jump on computer traffic. Suddenly it just spilled out, three-dimensionally, all over the landscape. You have to make allowances for the fact that everything we see tonight is real. There's a lot of polishing we still have to do, but that's what this exercise is all about. Now, I'm sure Trump supporters would see this as yet another glaring instance of government incompetence. However, we could say that this instance of simulation signals late capitalism's tendency to invert ends and means. The simulation is supposed to be a means to preventing this stuff, and now it's taken as the end. I want to move now to David Harvey, a Marxist geographer. And David Harvey tracks the transition from modernity to postmodernity in the mode of production. Specifically, he identifies the move from Fordism to post-Fordism as the crucial transformation that paves the way for postmodernism. Now, Fordism was a revolutionary production model based on the assembly line and vertical integration. Assembly line production requires the standardization of all parts. The final product was also fairly standard and devoid of options. As Henry Ford famously said, supposedly, of the Model T, you can have any color you want as long as it's black. Thank you. Standardization lowered production costs and yet also had economies of scale with mass production. In addition to the standardization of parts, the assembly line factory production of Fordism adopts scientific and rational principles of efficiency laid out by F.W. Taylor in his 1911 treatise, The Principles of Scientific Management. Taylorism, as it came to be known, set out to simplify the manufacturing process so that a trained monkey could perform the required tasks. The book described how labor productivity could be radically increased by breaking down each labor process into component motions and organizing fragmented work tasks according to rigorous standards of time and motion study. Very little skilled labor was necessary, which helped to keep labor costs nice and low. The results of assembly line production and the incorporation of Taylorism were the increased dehumanization and alienation of the workers. The turnover of labor was high, but the supply of unskilled labor in the form of fresh immigrants kept the factories running. The upside of Fordism was that Ford paid his workers pretty well. He wanted his employees to be able to afford and buy cars, Ford cars. The success of mass production hinged on promoting consumerism among the working class. Fordism also concentrated the manufacturing in one location, Detroit. Everything required for the automobile should be made in Detroit or as near as possible. Through centralization, Ford could minimize transportation costs for parts and other materials. Fordism was also about vertical integration, and the classical Hollywood studio system offers perhaps the best model. Film studios, at the time, owned stars and directors. They had them under contract. The films were shot on the studio lots. The film studios were the distributors of the film and then showed these films at theaters they also owned or had a hand in. Every step of the way, the film studios were involved and got a cut. Now, David Harvey contends that post-Fordism emerged in the crisis years between 1968 and 1973, particularly as a response to the 1973 recession, which was exacerbated or actually caused by the Arab oil embargo. Post-Fordism is characterized by flexible accumulation. For maximum flexibility, post-Fordism jettisoned the idea of vertical integration. Information technology enables companies to provide just-in-time production to eliminate vast inventories. Computers also enable firms to identify local trends more quickly to jump on them effectively. Unlike Fordism, post-Fordism relies on product differentiation, particularly changes that do not require numerous revamps to production. Different models that are subtly different but perhaps appeal to a slightly different demographic. Think of the various blends of coffee offered by Starbucks, or the different kind of Barbie dolls now. It used to be you got one. It was blonde, it was white. Now Barbies are a diverse crew, and you have many people who can buy Barbies. In terms of labor, flexible accumulation takes advantage of part-time labor to eliminate those pesky benefits, like health care and retirement. In addition, the company can respond more quickly to seasonal fluctuations in demand of its products or services and cut labor costs during down periods. More importantly, flexible accumulation subcontracts the work. By doing so, the company can cut the cord with subcontractors if it finds a cheaper competitor for its services, or just bail on the product line if it proves a failure. To increase flexibility, minimize the investment tied up in capital. Flexible accumulation also involves outsourcing. Flexible accumulation takes advantage of uneven development to capitalize on cheap labor markets across the globe. For example, I've used this as an example before, my beloved Fender Guitars makes guitars in the US, but labor isn't cheap, so they opened a factory in Japan in the 1970s to try to make a cheaper line of guitars. The problem is labor costs grew there too, so they opened a factory in Mexico for their cheaper line of instruments. But then, in the late 90s, China opened up. Holy crap, that's really cheap labor. Let's go to China. They opened up a line of guitars there in China. So one of the fundamental differences, and I'm going to wrap up this post-Fordism little thing here pretty quickly, one of the fundamental differences between Fordism and post-Fordism is in their use of advertising in the media. In Fordism, companies used advertising to convey information about their products. In post-Fordism, companies use advertising to create consumer desire. So the question is, how does this change within the economic base from Fordism to post-Fordism affect the superstructure, the realm of culture, and the domain which we English folks presumably want to study? For Harvey, post-Fordism or flexible accumulation brings about a change in the lived experience of time and space, and he calls this phenomenon TimeSpace Compression. I mean to signal by that term processes that so revolutionize the objective qualities of time and space that we are forced to alter, sometimes in quite radical ways, how we represent the world to ourselves. I use the word compression because a strong case can be made that the history of capitalism has been characterized by speed up in the pace of life, while so overcoming spatial barriers that the world sometimes seems to collapse inwards upon us. As space appears to shrink to a global village of telecommunications and a spaceship Earth of economic and ecological interdependencies, to use just two familiar and everyday images, and as time horizons shorten to the point where the present is all there is, so we have to learn to cope with an overwhelming sense of compression of our spatial and temporal worlds. One of the best examples, I think, we can see of where time and space compression works is in cyberpunk fiction. And William Gibson captures this in his cyberpunk classic Neuromancer. Night City was like a deranged experiment in social Darwinism designed by a bored researcher who kept one thumb permanently on the fast-forward button. Stop hustling and you sank without a trace, but move a little too swiftly and you'd break the fragile surface tension of the black market. Either way, you were gone, with nothing left of you but some vague memory in the mind of a fixture like rats, though heart or lungs or kidneys might survive in the service of some stranger with new yen for the clinic tanks. I should note that Harvey does not limit the experience of time-space compression to the transition from Fordism to post-Fordism or modernism to postmodernism. Modernity was characterized by its own particular form of time-space compression. Thus, Harvey argues that with postmodernity, we have just witnessed another fierce round in that process of annihilation of space through time that has always lain at the center of capitalism's dynamic. The moment you've all been waiting for, I'm sure. Frederick Jameson talks a little bit about postmodernity and postmodernism. Like Harvey, Frederick Jameson describes postmodernity as a historical period characterized by the transition into later multinational capitalism. Jameson links developments within the economic base of society with literary and cultural movements in the superstructure. This is, of course, the fundamental premise of any Marxist analysis. Changes to the base affect the superstructure. As capitalism evolves, so would the culture redirected in the or reflected in the cultural dominant of the age, to borrow Raymond Williams' term. In his original essay, Jameson followed the lead of Ernest Mandel and argued that we had entered this third stage of late or multinational capitalism at some point between 1945 and the 1960s. Accompanying this transition into a new form of capitalism was a cultural shift toward postmodernism in the arts, from Andy Warhol in visual art and Frank Gehry in architecture to Thomas Pynchon and Ishmael Reed in literature. First stage is market capitalism, and the second stage was monopoly capitalism or imperialism, and Jameson links these earlier forms of capitalism to the artistic movements of realism and modernism. So what characterizes multinational capitalism or globalization in postmodernity as a period, according to Jameson? Slavoj Žižek, and I figured I better just get my inevitable reference to his work over right away, since I don't want to keep you in suspense any longer, argues that multinational capitalism cuts its umbilical cord with its mother nation and treats its country of origin as simply another territory to be colonized. From outsourcing to offshore headquarters located in the Caribbean in order to avoid paying federal income taxes, these strategies of globalization are old hat by now. We should probably add to this list of features the magical character of finance capital, so that the performance of the company on the stock market becomes detached from its performance in the marketplace. Appearances matter more than sales. Witness the recent Wells Fargo scandal involving the creation of millions of fake banking accounts merely to influence stock prices. Jameson builds, where am I here? Excuse me. Jameson's essay, however, is more influential as a description of postmodernism rather than as a description of postmodernity. Jameson contends that the first fundamental feature of postmodernism as a style is the blending of high culture and mass culture, or the effacement in them of the older, essentially high modernist frontier between high culture and so-called mass or commercial culture, and the emergence of new kinds of text infused with the forms, categories, and contents of that very culture industry so passionately denounced by all the ideologues of the modern, from Levis and the American New Criticism all the way to Adorno and the Frankfurt School. I would like to elaborate on this trait of postmodernism because I think it accurately describes the postmodern fiction of everyone from Thomas Pynchon, who utilizes television sitcoms, and say Vineland, and Don DeLillo, who utilizes tabloids, to Margaret Atwood and Kathy Acker. The postmodernisms have, in fact, been fascinated precisely by this whole degraded landscape of schlock and kitsch, of TV series and Reader's Digest culture, of advertising in motels, of the Late Show and the grade B Hollywood film, of so-called paraliterature with its airport paperback categories of the Gothic and the romance, the popular biography, the murder mystery, and the science fiction or fantasy novel. Materials they no longer simply quote, or as Joyce and Mahler might have done, incorporate into their very substance. An even better example of this feature of postmodernism might be Art Spiegelman's Maus, a graphic novel of the Holocaust that tells the story of survival in Auschwitz of the author's father, Vladek, in comic book format. Jameson builds an extensive list of the features of postmodernism, beginning with what he calls depthlessness. And in order to kind of discuss this, he says, here we have Van Gogh's peasant shoes, and here we have Andy Warhol's diamond dust shoes. This evokes an entire life world of agricultural misery. This, who knows? It's kind of pretty, the photographic negative, but it's characterized by depthlessness. The key trait that I want to kind of emphasize, and that I think may actually survive today, is pastiche. And pastiche is, like parody, the imitation of a peculiar or unique idiosyncratic style, the wearing of a linguistic mask, speech in a dead language. But it is a neutral practice of such mimicry without any of parody's ulterior motives, amputated of the satiric impulse, devoid of laughter and of any conviction that alongside the abnormal tongue you have momentarily borrowed, some healthy linguistic normality still exists. Pastiche is thus blank parody, a statue with blind eyeballs. Now, I think kind of one of the best examples we can use is Inglorious Bastards. This Tarantino film is gloriously irreverent exercise in fantasy compensation, wish fulfillment, and the power of cinema. However, it is also an homage to World War II films like The Dirty Dozen, Kelly's Heroes, Where Eagles Dare, The Guns of Navarone, or Force 10 from Navarone, which assemble a ragtag group of misfits or strange bedfellows, and I'm thinking of the collaboration of the uptight British and rebellious Americans in The Great Escape, to battle and outwit the Nazis in some form of suicide operation with redemptive possibilities through sacrifice. Tarantino, the auteur, provides his signature touch with ultra-violence and memorable dialogue. Ultimately, however, Inglorious Bastards has nothing to do with history, since the ending of the film depicts, I'm going to give you a spoiler alert here, so if you haven't seen it, the death of Hitler at the hands of a Jewish theater owner. The film is ultimately a film about other films, and it does so in clever ways by commenting explicitly about the Nazis' use of propaganda films, particularly one about a heroic German sniper. Now, I'm going to skip ahead here. Jameson talks about the nostalgia film, that as a result of pastiche, we kind of lapse into nostalgia films. He cites American Graffiti, Star Wars. I think Forrest Gump actually does a better job of talking about the nostalgia film insofar as generations' images that we have become history. So we are condemned to seek history by way of our own pop images and simulacra of that history, which itself remains forever out of reach. Now, Jameson, when he's discussing this, makes a curious choice to exemplify the loss of historical sense. This is another one of those kind of principal features that pastiche and nostalgia films discuss. And he says that E.L. Doctorow's Ragtime is this interesting thing. He says that the mixture of historical figures, Emma Goldman, Harry Dexter White, Henry Ford, J.P. Morgan, and Harry Houdini, fictional characters, the family, and intertextual characters like Coalhouse Walker make it impossible for us to receive their representation without the prior interception of already acquired knowledge or doxa. Now, the last person that I want to kind of talk about is Linda Hutcheon, who takes Jameson to task for this position. She argues instead But it's just as easy to argue that in that very novel, the historical referent is very present. And in spades, not only is there an accurate evocation of a particular period of early 20th century American capitalism with due representation of all classes involved, but historical personages also appear within the fiction. Of course, it is this received history that Jameson objects to. Yet, that is the major means to making the reader aware of the particular nature of the historical referent. There is also no conflict between historical reconstruction, construction, and the politics of the novel, as has been claimed. Indeed, they are mutually supportive. If Doctorow does use nostalgia, it is always ironically turned against itself. Hutcheon further contends that the most notable genre of postmodern fiction is what she calls historiographic metafiction, which is a return to history that refutes the natural or common sense methods of distinguishing between historical fact and fiction. It refuses the view that only history has a truth claim, both by questioning the ground of that claim in historiography and by asserting that both history and fiction are discourses, human constructs, signifying systems, and both derive their major claim to truth from that identity. For Hutcheon, Salman Rushdie's Midnight's Children perfectly exemplifies her conception of historiographic metafiction. The personal history of Salim Sinai mirrors, if not produces in some cases, the history of India. Born on the stroke of midnight on August 15, 1947, at the very moment that India becomes independent from Great Britain, Salim was mysteriously handcuffed to history. His destinies indissolubly changed chained to those of his country. Like the other children of midnight born in that hour, he is endowed with magical powers. In his case, telepathy. The novel problematizes its own narrative by calling into question certain errors in chronology or interpretation. And Salim notices that in his narration, he gets the date of Gandhi's assassination wrong. So he writes, "Rereading my work, I have discovered an error in chronology. The assassination of Mahatma Gandhi occurs in these pages on the wrong date. But I cannot say now what the actual sequence of events might have been. In my India, Gandhi will continually die at the wrong time. Does one error invalidate the entire fabric? Am I so far gone in my desperate need for meaning that I'm prepared to distort everything? To rewrite the world history of my times purely in order to place myself in a central role? Today, in my confusion, I can't judge. I'll have to leave it for others. For me, there can be no going back. I must finish what I've started, even if, inevitably, what I finish turns out not to be what I began." I happen to believe that Hutcheon is absolutely right about the prevalence of historiographic metafiction and postmodernism and the way in which the genre problematizes the historical sense. Jameson seems off the mark in his dismissal of postmodern fiction. Many of the greatest novels of postmodernism, Thomas Pynchon's Vineland, Mason and Dixon, Don DeLille's Libra, Handmaid's Tale, Silko's Almanac of the Dead, these are all historiographic metafiction. However, Jameson does seem correct in his estimation that postmodernism, particularly with the practice of pastiche, has become the cultural dominant, only 30 years later than he initially proposed. In 1984, I would contend postmodernism was still an emergent cultural practice. Today, it is the mainstream. And so to wrap up, postmodernism may have waned as a literary practice, but postmodernity continues whether we characterize our contemporary period as the era of globalization, the post-industrial society, the media society, the society of the spectacle, or the consumer society. These phenomena have only intensified in the 32 years since the publication of Jameson's essay. Nevertheless, postmodernism survives today in the form of pastiche in Hollywood and on television. The most acclaimed TV show of the past summer and its breakout hit was the Netflix series Stranger Things. If you haven't seen it, just imagine every 80s movie rolled into one. The setting is the Indiana of Breaking Away and Close Encounters of the Third Kind. While we're on the subject of Spielberg, throw in E.T. A lot of E.T. Probably the Goonies too, although I have never seen it, so I can't judge. There's Stephen King with Firestarter. There is John Hughes with the awkwardness of high school and a potential romance brewing between two people from different sides of the track, a la Pretty in Pink. Nightmare on Elm Street looms very large. The soundtrack is fascinating because it contains all of the cool stuff we know about 30 years later, although very few people listened to them at the time. Joy Division, New Order, Cure, Echo and the Bunnymen. And the synth music for the opening credits and the background music is shockingly evocative of The Thing and Terminator. Then there's the casting. Winona Ryder and Matthew Modine, two of the it stars of that era, return to the cast. Stranger Things is pastiche, blank parody and mimicry devoid of any satiric impulse. It is glorious, like Tarantino's work, but the show's appeal to nostalgia through this imitation of outdated styles is shameless. That is part of its charm. Thank you.